bringing it back to staff.
Okay, thank you. First, I'd just like to maybe take a step back collectively as a room and just may refocus this discussion on to first note that staff does recognize that this was a very serious violation, the installation of these two spur pipes and the risers which were draining this wetland area. And Commission staff and the staff of Fish and Wildlife have been working very closely together to bring this application to you to resolve or partially resolve the ongoing resource damage. That was our first mission here, which, as Mr. Takai had just mentioned, is water is draining out of this wetland, the freshwater marsh, and we need to stop that right away. And that is an interim stopgap measure only, while Fish and Wildlife continues to develop a longer-term, much more comprehensive restoration plan for a much larger area of Ballona. And to acknowledge some of the issues that were said, first I'd like to say that staff really does appreciate this large public response and this amount of concern about Ballona. It tells me that I think we should concentrate on our similarities, that we all have a very shared goal here, which is protection of Ballona and these resources. But there is no dispute of what is a wetland here, and the request by Mr. Davis and Ms. McPherson that a wetland delineation and other technical studies were necessary. Staff just disagrees with that. We didn't require a new wetland delineation for the project that's before us because it was about capping these two unpermitted pipes in the middle of a much larger wetland. Everything there is a wetland. So we're simply focusing our review on the project before us, which is the capping. And similar to that, these qualities or the issues regarding water quality and the hydrology that were mentioned by some of the opponents, and by Ms. McPherson specifically, again, that is not related to the project that is before us today. If we could bring up slide number 3, please. I'd just like to point out something on that image, which is a lot of these issues are related to the much larger issues with the Ballona wetlands and their management. Now, you can see in this image that long pipe here that leads from freshwater marsh into the Ballona Channel. That was the pipe that they were discussing. It was permitted in the Commission's 1991 Coastal Development Permit, and that's legal. All that we're looking at today are the two unpermitted spur pipes, these two little black lines leading to the red dots. That was the violation. The concept, though, is for us, the hydrology would be restored on this site by stopping the water on our site from going into those pipes, and that's what we have to accomplish here. Now, as Ms. Fosberg had indicated, her preference was that the spur drains and the risers should be removed in their entirety, and that was staff's preference as well, and that was our first question to Fish and Wildlife, is can we just get rid of those now? Now, that is one alternative, but the reason that staff has agreed, and as did many of the opponents through the settlement agreement that was reached with Fish and Wildlife, is that at this point, to stop the ongoing resource damage, the way to achieve that is by simply capping this. The removal of those pipes, it's either removal or proper abandonment. That would be part of this much larger project, and that is what is related to this draft environmental impact report that does not necessarily relate to this project. It's for that much larger restoration project that Fish and Wildlife is developing. They're going to be going back in, disturbing a much larger area that includes the project site. It makes sense given that there are archaeological concerns and there are archaeological resources, other wetland resources that would be disturbed as part of that much larger project. So we agree that it's logical then that as part of that much larger project, that's when you would evaluate going back in, having the additional disturbance related to the full removal of those pipes occur, and that is being addressed through that environmental impact report that was mentioned. And then once that solution has been developed, that would come back to the Commission at that time. And our special condition 4 in the staff report requires that. So as Ms. Fosberg was concerned, it does not let any of the property owners or previous violators off the hook. In fact, our condition requires that within 5 years, they come back, submit an application, whether it's been done through that much larger project or not, for the full restoration of the areas of the site that were disturbed as part of the violation, meaning the 2 spur pipes. And to us, we think that's just the appropriate way to get the proper order. What this permit today would allow us to do, though, is to get out there immediately and stop the water from draining down the pipe by capping it and plugging those weep holes. With that, Ms. Henry, do we have any additional comments? We would like to have our enforcement staff address some of the issues that were raised during the public comment as well.
Honestly say I've never spoken from this position before. I just wanted to explain, and Steve covered a lot of the ground, and I would also refer you to pages 7 and 8 of the staff report, which has a really good summary of what the history of the enforcement was here. There are a lot of allegations that were thrown around today about environmental hazards and violations, and many of them just aren't ones that fall within the rubric of the Coastal Commission. The ones that do, we're very concerned about. As Steve said, we completely share the concerns. We think that draining a wetland is about the most amazing violation that you could have. I mean, putting a drain in a wetland is exactly the opposite of anything that you do in a wetland. It was installed by Playa Capital when they owned it, and we haven't opened a case against them, and as they said, and is summarized in the staff report, we did write them a number of letters and tried to work with them and negotiate with them, and we weren't able to do it. But California Department of Fish and Wildlife bought the property, and this permit action before you today is a result of both our enforcement efforts and the settlement reached in the private litigation. And that settlement litigation specifically required this very CDP. And as you may be aware, we have somewhat different enforcement options when the owner of a property is another state agency. And so we've been trying to figure out, given the constraints that we're working under, what was the most effective way to resolve this violation. From our perspective, the most important thing was to cap those pipes and stop the draining of the wetland as quickly as possible. And this CDP provides that opportunity. Several commenters mentioned the option of getting penalties, and I would just note again to you that the owner of the property is a state agency, and also that although we love our administrative penalties, and this hopefully will not be true in the future, but as of now, they only extend to access violations, and we can't get administrative penalties for violations that don't involve an access, even if they're serious and involve something like a wetlands. So in summary, we agree with many of the comments that folks have raised, and the enforcement staff has taken this case very seriously and support the CDP and taking the soonest steps as possible to stop the draining of the wetland. We're available if you have any questions. Andrew Willis has worked on this case directly, and he's here as well.
Okay, and that concludes staff